Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through some information to help you fill out your AP study form. Where it says your name here, put your name, haha. Title would be Lord of the Flies, and the author is William Golding, and the copyright date is 1954. Okay. This PowerPoint goes through about the author and biographical information relevant to a study of the book. Skip to literary movement. It would be part of modern literature. And then the very last on page 1, genre. I would put adventure novel. I think that's probably the best genre to put this in. Okay, so this PowerPoint, I will just quickly go through some information about Mr. Golding that I think could go under about the author or biographical information, and I'll tell you which it should go under. Hang on. Okay, so William Golding was born in 1911, died in 1993. He studied science and English. I would put the next 2 bullet points under biographical information relevant to a study of his book. He fought in the Royal Navy during World War II. Not only did he fight, he was part of one of the most bloody conflicts, or battles, I should say, during World War II, the invasion of Normandy. So both of those really altered the way he viewed the world and then changed his writing as a consequence. He went into war having a sense of optimism and thinking that, you know, all people are wonderful and good. And he thought, I don't know, if push comes to shove, if I could actually kill a man. Then, after seeing what he saw, especially on D-Day, he was very disillusioned by that. When the war ended, he did return to teaching and writing. He eventually won the Nobel Prize for the book that we're studying. The last 2 bullet points on here, I'm just going to point out because during World War II, Britain was being bombed, I should say, about 24/7. So they thought, okay, let's try to keep the children safe. So they were evacuating kids to other countries. Well, the Germans found out what they were doing, and so they would take their boats and try to sink the ships with all the kids on them, and they were successful in killing about 500 kids on this one ship. And so that ended the program to ship the kids elsewhere to keep them safe. A few events, basic events of World War II. I'm guessing most of you have a cursory knowledge of what happened in World War II. So you don't really need to write that down anywhere. I would write this down, maybe under about the author. This is what William Golding said about writing Lord of the Flies. He said, "It was simply what seemed sensible for me to write after the war when everyone was thanking God they weren't Nazis. I'd seen enough to realize that every single one of us could be Nazis." It's a really jarring statement. But again, he went in with this, you know, optimism, like people are wonderful and good. And when he left the war, he had learned maybe a little too much about what people are capable of doing. A few other things, and this would go under biographical information relevant to a study of the book. He, as a teacher, decided to just let his class just kind of do as they would. And during this, they got into such a heated debate, they started throwing punches. So that's when he realized, okay, wait a minute, if left to their own devices, this is how things turn out. So that inspired his writing, his experiences in war, which I talked about already. The book Coral Island was very popular in its day. It was an adventure book that everyone read, and it's basically boys that get shipwrecked on this island, and they build, you know, huts, and they sing Kumbaya, and everyone gets along, and it all ends happily, and everyone's perfect. And he says, yeah, or not. So he wrote this book as kind of a counter to that. And then philosophical questions that he had, especially after the war. One of his big influences was John Hobbes. And the second point under that, Hobbes believed that man by nature is individualistic and selfish. And the very last point, men need to be controlled by absolute sovereignty in order to avoid brutish behavior. So this is definitely a philosophical influence that came into play in his writing of this book. This you don't need to really write down. I just think it's worth mentioning for those of us who have tried and failed at something. His novel was rejected 21 times before it was published. And then when it was published, it took about a decade for it to become successful. So if you feel like, oh, I'm never going to make it, Golding felt the same way. And he ended up, being an author that was very revered. So persistence pays. So much like the evacuation of children during World War II from Britain, that's basically how our novel starts. We have boys being evacuated from Britain because they are at war. Their plane gets shot down, and none of the adults survive, but some of the children do. I'm going to pause. Okay, back. Sorry about that. Golding's message. So again, I would put this about the author. Another quote. I know that's a lot. He said, the theme is an attempt to trace the defects of society back to the defects of human nature, which he is basically saying that society is defective and terrible because humans are defective and terrible, which you could definitely argue with, but that's his view on things. Okay, motifs. I want to say it's on page 6. I could be wrong. It's on page 5. I am wrong. So motifs, it's about halfway down the page. Survival. And motifs, by the way, are recurring patterns. Symbols are, more objects, but a motif is a pattern that continues to occur or recur, either one is correct, throughout the book. Survival is kind of an obvious one because they're on a deserted island. They hope to survive. Leadership styles, we'll see different leadership styles emerge in the different boys that are there. Civilization versus savagery. Is it easier to just be animals, or should they continue to try to maintain a civilized manner? Loss of innocence. And then human nature. And underneath that, the duality of man. Every human has two sides. Nature versus nurture. How does nature, in our nature influences versus how we are nurtured, or our environment, and good versus evil. Then we've got his literary technique. So right below that, on page 5, it says the author's style. That's where I would put this. He uses a ton of symbolism, and symbolism that's pretty obvious and apparent. It won't need to be pointed out to you. You'll be like, okay, I understand that the conch shell is important because. He does use irony quite a bit. Lots of imagery, which helps because then it helps us kind of feel as if we were on that deserted island with these boys. Allusions, mostly biblical allusions. So if you even have a cursory knowledge of the Bible, there'll be things that you pick up on. And then lots of figurative language, which I think makes his writing stronger, and I think makes most people's authors' writing stronger. Lastly, essential questions, and these are on page 2. So what makes an individual powerful? I think that's a good question to consider as the book progresses, especially. And the second one, do individuals control groups, or do groups control individuals? Again, becomes more interesting the further we get into the book. How does a society maintain order? How do fear and desire for acceptance influence human behavior? I really like this one because I think it's so applicable to all ages, not just teens. And I think that often we say, oh, teens need to be accepted. Adults are the same way, so they can just stop saying silly things. And then lastly, are people inherently good or evil? Now, granted, these aren't the only essential questions that come up. They're ones that I hope you'll consider as we read. That's about all. So we'll be filling in the rest of things as we go along. If you have any questions about this or some of this didn't make sense, always feel free to ask. Okay? Thanks, guys.